but something needs to be done to deal with all these government programs. Medicare and Medicaid, also known as autopilot spending programs, have continued to expand to comprise more and more of the federal budget, crowding out all other spending, including defense, infrastructure, and federal law enforcement. These programs are driving our debt, and a failure to address them head-on is a failure to take our spending-driven debt crisis seriously. More recently, as the federal government ran up against its statutory debt limit, most members of the House again recognized the need to put forward a plan that addresses not only short-term need to meet our obligations, but also the long-term need to rein in out-of-control government spending. The plan I supported in the House was called Cut, Cap, and Balance. As the name suggests, the first step was to cut $111 billion from this year's budget for instant savings. The next step is the institution of a statutory cap on federal spending over the next 10 years of just under 20% of our GDP, which is the historic pre-stimulus level. Finally, and frankly I believe most importantly, the bill would send a balanced budget amendment to the states for their ratification. Bucks County businesses, Bucks County families, Bucks County government, and 49 out of 50 states have to balance their budgets. It's about time the federal government followed suit and did the same. Unfortunately, this legislation, Cut, Cap, and Balance, fell a few votes short in the United States Senate, and the President declared Cut, Cap, and Balance dead on arrival even before it was voted on in the House. While Cut, Cap, and Balance was my preferred plan, I could not risk a default on our obligations and the accompanying economic turmoil. Recognizing this reality, I supported the Budget Control Act of 2011, a compromise between the House, the Senate, and the President. This framework consists of three main features. It cuts spending more than it raises the debt limit, creates a bipartisan bicameral committee tasked with sending proposals to the full House and full Senate for an additional between $1.2 and $1.5 trillion in savings, and brings a balanced budget amendment up for a vote by the end of this year in both chambers, both the House and the Senate. This was a compromise that prevented a devastating default, held the line on refusing to increase taxes, and guaranteed an up or down vote on a balanced budget amendment, which is a measure that I believe the American people overwhelmingly support. This compromise was an important step, but it's left us still with much work to do. While the plan has been criticized by some for cutting too deep, and by others for not doing enough to address the record deficits, it's an important start, in my view. You can't turn a ship around on a dime, and you can't turn the ship of state around overnight. But for the first time, perhaps since World War II, we've changed the conversation in Washington, where Congress after Congress after Congress have come to Washington, and year after year talked about how can they spend more than the year before. For the first time since directly after World War II, we've changed the conversation in Washington from how much can we spend over last year to how much can we save. All of these plans, the Path to Prosperity, Cut, Cap, and Balance, and the Budget Control Act, have a single goal in mind: create an environment of predictability and stability in which you, the small business community, the job creators, can grow our economy and can put Americans back to work. Fiscal stability alone will not create jobs, but it's an important prerequisite to pro-growth environment, an environment in which government spending does not crowd out private investment. We could eliminate entire federal departments and confiscate every dollar of taxable income from every millionaire and every billionaire in this country, and we would still not be able to close the budget deficit or begin to pay off our national debt. Our debt crisis is too monumental to rely on tax hikes or spending cuts alone to solve it. The only real and lasting solution is to grow the economy to create jobs. Doing so expands the tax base and increases revenues to the government without raising anyone's rates, while continuing to cut waste, fraud, and abuse in the massive federal bureaucracy. Small businesses account for the vast majority of new job creation in this country. But how can we expect you to invest in equipment or a new employee when you don't know what your tax rate is going to be in 5 or 10 years, or your liabilities under President Obama's new health care program? As I visit with small businesses across the 8th Congressional District, the constant message I've come away with is that this Congress needs to pursue policies that are going to provide stability and predictability in terms of taxation, regulation, and litigation for job creators. Taxation is probably the most obvious of the three, but also the most important. As I mentioned a moment ago, small businesses are not going to hire a new employee or invest in new equipment today when they're not sure what they're going to be paying in taxes tomorrow. Even the larger corporations are holding back on capital investment for fear that increased taxes will be coming down the line. The recession, ironically, has taught businesses to operate more efficiently, but there's no incentive for them to expand and to begin hiring if they're going to be saddled with massive new tax obligations to help feed the federal government's excessive appetite. That's not to say that changes are not required in our tax code. We need significant reforms in the U.S. federal tax code. We must adopt real tax reform that includes a fairer, flatter, more predictable tax code and closes loopholes that allow corporations like GE to avoid paying any federal taxes, federal corporate net income taxes whatsoever. There have been calls to eat the rich and raise taxes on the wealthy, but it doesn't do any good raising what is already the highest corporate tax rate in the world if corporations can simply hire a good accountant, a well-connected lawyer, or a slick lobbyist to get out of paying their fair share. Again, we can look to Greece for an example of why this doesn't work. There was a story in the New York Times back in May of last year that talked about the tax that the Greek government had imposed on swimming pools. If you were wealthy enough to own a pool, the reasoning went, you ought to pay a tax on that luxury. Well, when the tax returns started coming in, only 324 residents of a wealthy Athens suburb checked the box to pay the pool tax. Tax investigators thought that something didn't quite sound right, so they analyzed satellite pictures similar to Google Maps. They counted 16,974 swimming pools. So just because you raise rates or impose a new tax does not mean you're going to bring in more revenue. In fact, many times it has the opposite effect. So while the Greeks have created their own loopholes, here in the United States, we have institutionalized ways around the tax code. Take, for example, the NASCAR tax break for building new racetracks, or the tax breaks for importers of tackle boxes. We even have a tax break for, and I kid you not, Eskimo whaling captains. These incentives may have been written into our tax code with the best of intentions, but they've outlived their usefulness and must be ended as we work toward balanced budgets in the nation's capital. Regulation is another impediment to job creation. While the power to legislate is explicitly delegated to the House of Representatives, the Senate, our modern system has turned over much of that responsibility to bureaucrats within the various executive agencies by allowing them to write a myriad of rules and regulations that guide the legislative framework that we pass in the United States Congress. This has led to burdensome overregulation in various departments and industries, from the EPA to the FCC to healthcare, thanks in large part to the Affordable Care Act of 2010. The problem with these regulations handed down from the executive branch is that they receive minimal congressional oversight. And that's why I've become a co-sponsor of a bill called the REINS Act. This bill institutes congressional review for all new regulations that are expected to have an economic impact in excess of $100 million per year. Not only does this restore the process that is set out in the United States Constitution, but it also allows Congress to ensure that the executive branch is not regulating our small businesses to the point where they need to hire new employees to comply with federal regulations or complete paperwork rather than produce a product or provide a service. The problems I've outlined here today are no doubt difficult ones. Our recovery has been anemic at best. We have a Senate which refuses to act and a president who refuses to lead. But I have faith in the American people and the members here at the Lower Bucks Chamber of Commerce, because I know that you get it. You may not agree with every vote that I cast, but I believe we can all agree. When our federal government spends for every dollar in Washington, it borrows 42 cents. Most of it borrowed from the Chinese, and we continue to hand that bill year after year to our children and to their children. I think we can agree that that has to stop. So let me take a look at the debt clock here while I've been speaking. I see Clark's looking at his watch, so probably trying for me to wrap this up. Debt clock, $14 trillion, $599 billion, $113 million. It's still rising. So we have some historic challenges, and I think it's going to require some pretty significant solutions. I want to sort of wrap up, because I think I get a chance to take a couple of questions, right, Clark? I want to wrap up with a quote from my favorite president, Abraham Lincoln. She said during his second address to the United States Congress, President Lincoln said, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves." I think that's telling. Together we must work to ensure the legacy we leave behind, make certain that it's a strong economy supported by the American people, and a government that lives within its means. With that, let's have some questions.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to thank everybody who wrote in. Needless to say, we had many more questions than we'll have time for. We try to combine some of them so that we can double dip as I ask the questions. We really appreciate your time and effort, and I apologize ahead of time for not being able to ask everything that was asked this morning. The first one is, will there be changes to the small business tax rate?
The question is, will there be changes to the small business taxing? Well, as I mentioned in the remarks, the United States government today has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It might be second to Japan. If Japan hasn't already lowered it, it's scheduled to be lowered, making the United States corporate tax the highest at 35%. And I know that there are calls in order to close the federal annual budget deficit, it's begin paying off the national debt, there are calls to raise taxes. And as I said in my remarks, I don't think we can cut enough, and I don't think we can raise taxes enough to get the economy back on track and the federal budget back on a path of being balanced. We have to get people back to work. And so every decision we make and every debate that we have in the United States Congress, whether we're talking about patent reform, or we're talking about tax reform, we're talking about regulation, I think need to be geared and focused on what it takes to get Americans back to work. It's the only thing that's going to lift up our economy. And I happen to believe you can have this discussion about raising the corporate tax rate in America. But if you have companies, like I mentioned earlier, GE, that the 35% tax rate pays no corporate net income tax, you can raise that to 40%. You can raise it to 45 or 50%. Those clever companies, with their high-priced accountants, slick attorneys, they'll find a way not to pay. And so I think